Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew, and you're listening to Proto-Future, a podcast about running model trains really, really fast.
This is episode 16, Interview with Lucid Stew. In this episode, I talk with possibly the country's singular foremost expert on high-speed rail. A few notes before we begin. This is a field-recorded interview, which, as I am told, is unadvisable. I recovered almost all of the audio to listenable standards, but please forgive me the occasional faint line or a drowning out by a DMU, which, yes, we will cover. Anyway, I traveled to Redlands, California after rail fanning the Metrolink Arrow and arrived at a station cast in a shadow by a humongously tall individual dressed in his typical CAHSR road-tripping hat. Despite his channel character's acerbic and sometimes scathing quality, something which I myself can appreciate, and is assuredly warranted of the subjects he covers, the real Lucid Stew is an overwhelmingly kind and jovial person. We hit it off immediately.
My channel is Lucid Stew on YouTube. I have been producing content on YouTube for almost 10 years now. I came from a totally different space. I used to produce videos about video games that made video games. So that's inception enough for anyone listening. And the last platform that I did that on died off. So I just kind of stopped. And then I got into a situation where I was out in Missouri for work. I had moved out there for work, and then I got laid off from that job. And while I was selling all of my stuff so that I could move back to California, I had some free time on my hands, so I started putting these two videos together.
I was going to say Missouri, the famous high-speed rail capital of America.
Yeah, exactly. Beautiful area in St. Louis. I enjoyed it a lot, but I did not have employment there anymore, so I was looking at weeks or maybe a couple of months to get rid of everything. And so I had some time on my hands. I started putting these videos together. They were a little bit more intensive than I was used to, so they did take quite a bit of time to do, but that got the ball rolling. As far as what do I do? One is covering high-speed rail news, U.S. specific, and one of the reasons for that was, I knew I didn't know enough about the subject, so I knew I was going to have to dive into it. I could not find a place that collated all of the news on a regular basis, and so I just said, you know what, if I'm going to be doing this for myself anyway, I'll share it with everyone else and we'll see if anyone watches it. The news does all right. It's not like a premiere video or anything, but that's part of my education, and then I get to kind of share that and inform other people at the same time, because there are plenty of people that are interested in the subject. It's kind of like this industry news type of deal where people just want to duck into high-speed rail every once in a while and find out what's been going on with it, and I can relate to that, just like I was saying, from the same perspective of infrastructure and technology and all that stuff. I like to geek out on that every once in a while and find out what's going on with different projects. Another one along kind of in the same vein was the FRA high-speed rail corridors
series, where he uses the Unreal Engine video game drivers, server racks, Google Maps data, and his own programming to make video renders of high-speed rail lines throughout the landscapes of the United States, estimating costs based off of existing HSR projects, and finding alignments capable of hosting curves with up to a 12-kilometer radii required for multi-100-kilometer-per-hour travel, while minimizing property acquisition and demolition.
That was another thing, just diving in. I had no idea. I really didn't know how extensive the federal thought was on the subject.
Well, thought-heavy, light action, but...
Yeah, exactly. But, so, along those lines, those corridors are mostly aimed at 110-mile-per-hour diesel-electric. And, like you said, it's taking forever. For instance, St. Louis to Chicago is an example. That wasn't particularly cheap. And so my thought was, instead of taking 25 or 30 years to get to 110 miles per hour, why don't we just do true high speed now and leapfrog that? Because if you're waiting, several decades just to get 110 mile per hour diesel electric in, how long is it going to be before you can electrify and get up to speed? It's going to be a long, long time. And from the environmental perspective, whether a person cares about it or not, our society is moving in a direction where that's an important issue. This is a thing with me in California as well. This may stun some people, it may not. I drive a car, it's an internal combustion engine.
Gasp, I'm going to get you canceled.
Yeah. I grew up out here in the suburbs. I'm used to driving everywhere. When we talk about things like, replacing freeway lanes or road diets or like that, I'm like, hold on a second, let's consider the people who drive too. But at the same time, it's just a political reality in California that we're really not going to build any more freeways. And so if the population of California is going to continue to grow, we have to find other ways of moving people. So, one of those things was just, kind of dealing with political realities and seeing which way the wind is blowing. And one way the wind is blowing is rail is going to be electric eventually. Whether it takes 50 years or 100 years, rail is going to be electric. So why wait? If we can get it in now, if we can get it in cheaply, let's do it now. Because this is one of the problems with California high-speed rail. Very expensive to do it now. If we had done it 30 years ago, would have been cheaper. If you look at a place like Texas, when they were talking about Texas TGV in the 90s, they could have built that for $8 billion. Okay, maybe it went over budget and was $15 billion, right? But they would have had that in place already for $15 billion, and it would be running already.
But now it's like $115 billion per mile.
Exactly, yeah. Statewide system could be in operation in Texas already. Texas is going to add like 20 million people in the next 30 or 40 years, and that would be really great to have in place first before all that growth, so that you could absorb some of that traffic and keep it off the road. But instead, they're going to put all of that traffic on the road, except for the very meager ridership that they're getting out of the projects that you've seen personally.
Here, he's referencing the month-long cross-country Amtrak trip I took to ride, bicycle, and photograph every DMU in the US. I'm trying to get Railroad Model Craftsman and the Passenger Train Journal to publish an article series on this, and even if that does happen, I've been debating making another mini-series lasting nearly a year about said journey, describing my experiences with each DMU and what they teach us about modeling, either prototypically or for Proto-Future freelancing. Anyway, such was entirely why Lucid Stew met me at the Redland station of the Metrolink Aero DMU service.
So those were kind of my thoughts on the subject, where this is going to be electric. It really, really is. Whether the freights like it or not, whether we build the infrastructure now or not, eventually that's what we're going to do, because something needs to be done about the amount of carbon that's being pumped into the atmosphere sooner or later to stop it at some level. That's a political pressure that's not going away.
Well, at this point, I think the thing that's going to stop it is going to be an extinction event.
Yeah, let's hope we don't get to that point. But, it also in particular, we've talked about this a little on a different tangent in my Discord. You know what, older generations are going to die off, and younger generations are coming in with different ideas, and you're going to have this political turnover. And especially the way that politics is going now, where, we had this kind of little temporary shift to the left, and then we had this right backlash that we're going through right now. As the boomers, let's say, transition out of the political cycle and younger people transition in, I think we're going to have another reaction and a pretty big swing to the left. And so I think in probably 20 or 30 years, the political landscape is going to be a lot different and a lot more conducive to what we're talking about.
Oh, Lucid, I hope for that so much. If you had asked me before the 2024 shift to the worst timeline, I would have wholeheartedly agreed. My worry is that those who can be duped can be duped. Something is fundamentally broken in America, chief amongst which is education, and cripplingly many people are making it out of high school completely scientifically illiterate. This is not things like math or even the desperate need for a high school class in civics, how to file your taxes, and other basic shit. I'm talking a level deeper, where some people seem incapable of internalizing the concept of true things, and that science is correcter than whatever shit they read about on the cesspool of Facebook or Instagram. The ability to discern fundamental logic is not just imperiled, but has already atrophied and died in our society. And while he is probably right in the long run, and there is hopefully a good chance that I'm wrong, and that millennials will regret their pandemic move to the bland and worthless suburbs, Gen Z will snap to their senses and stop being masculine, Gen Alpha will delete all AI slop apps, anti-transit boomers will die even faster, and the whole goddamn country, if not world, finally realizes that cars and single-family homes are fundamentally environmentally immoral. But even if all of that happens, we're still talking 20 years in the future, at least. I will be 20 years closer to the grave by then, and many others will already be 2 meters under. That's too damn bloody long for something that should have been done already. And that's even assuming it was 100% guaranteed to finally someday happen, which under current fascist political regimes, it most certainly is not. And furthermore, this is all stuff that should have been done not 20 years from now, not now, but 40 years ago. We are a lifetime and multiple generations behind peer countries, and I cannot for the life of me comprehend how we arrived at this point with people empty-headedly chatting Murica with pride, not shame. Not to use Lucid Stew's truly insightful points to platform my extremism, but I'm just done with this country, and all the shit-for-brains ideas it represents. I would much rather give all and more of my tax dollars to countries that have already bitten the bullet and done the hard thing the moment it cropped up, not us who procrastinate to oblivion, at best. Until policy positions that are pro-trains and anti-car, pro-queer and anti-racism, and pro-immigration, anti-religion, and anti-Israel are completely bipartisan issues, which actually get immediate results, I'm just out. There's no point to living in America anymore, at least for me. I'm sorry, Back to the interview, and Lucid Stew's much more insightful and worthwhile comments.
And those are all reasons that I was figuring let's start talking about it now, rather than waiting until then. That was one reason for the FRA corridors, just to talk about doing it for real instead of, getting this kind of interim solution in over the course of decades.
In case you forgot it already at this point, given the great length of our discussion, we are covering what it is he does as a creator.
Oh, another one I've got coming up, and hopefully, I got my fingers crossed on this one, hopefully Brightline West is going to start construction for real. They are working at their Las Vegas station, but it would be really nice if they started working in the right-of-way, if they got all their financing handled, because then I would be going out there every month and start covering the construction. And this was another thing that was kind of just signals from YouTube and encouragement from viewers. I asked my subscribers, should I get a drone so that I can cover this? Yeah, get a drone. Okay, I'll get a drone. So now I got the drone. I'm doing the aerial footage. Same thing with the GoPro, so that I can go out there and do that. And that's the main gist of the channel, is just trying to cover what's happening with high-speed rail in the United States and just postulating some possibilities maybe in places where people haven't thought about it.
From the mention of Brightline, we talked about the then just recently announced High Desert Corridor.
What they have envisioned in the interim before they can finish California High-Speed Rail Phase 1 is this Southwest High-Speed Rail.
To bring those who don't know up to speed, or at least as quickly as I can given the decades of twists and turns, there are now currently 2 high-speed rail, or HSR, projects underway in California. California High-Speed Rail, or CAHSR, and Brightline West. CAHSR was originally intended to connect Los Angeles and San Diego with San Francisco and Sacramento. Due to California's shameful car brain and unwillingness to fund the necessary expenditures of the project and instead throwing good money after bad to maintain its automobile violence infrastructure, CAHSR is decades behind schedule, and first trimmed San Diego and Sacramento as Phase 2 of the project, then trimmed the LA to San Francisco Phase 1 even further by building the IOS, or Initial Operating Segment, between Bakersfield and Madera. Since further extensions into LA are massively complicated by tough mountain terrain south of Palmdale and will likely take decades further to complete, and because Brightline has been making comparatively great time between Las Vegas and Rancho Cucamonga, though not without its own incredible delays, a short 60 or so kilometer connector called the High Desert Corridor between Palmdale on CAHSR and Victorville on Brightline was proposed to mooch off of Brightline's work and get trains running to LA's metro area earlier than CAHSR could do on its own. It's an ingenious solution to a problem that never should have existed in the first place.
They are utilizing Caltrain, hooking into that at Gilroy, building California High-Speed Rail to Palmdale, hooking into the High Desert Corridor project from there to Brightline West at Victorville. And then, since the portion from Palmdale to LA is very expensive, I think it's going to be a very long time until they do it. What they can do instead in that paradigm that we were just talking about is the California High-Speed Rail will be able to hook up with Brightline West at Victor Valley. You'll be able to take Brightline West down to Rancho Cucamonga, possibly through to all these other places that we were talking about, Coachella Valley, Riverside, and LA. And so you can conceive of either a 1 or 2 seat ride between San Francisco and LA, or San Francisco and Coachella.
Well, one of my thoughts is, why didn't they ever consider, at least even just temporarily, electrifying the Antelope Valley line, kind of like Palmdale, Lancaster area? Because, I mean, yeah, it's not going to be high-speed rail, it would be slow-speed rail, but it would be a 1-seat ride.
Right.
Or is it just literally so insanely slow at like 15, 25 miles an hour in parts?
It's pretty slow. I figured for one of my videos that you could probably get it down to about 90 minutes on an express, which, if you consider that in addition to how fast California High-Speed Rail is between Gilroy and Palmdale, which still wouldn't be bad at all. I mean, it would be a lot, probably twice as fast as what exists right now.
Hell, you don't even have to electrify it. You just get a diesel with one of those like couplers in the end and just drag it down.
Right. Yeah. In the Discord, Ben from ESPA, the Empire State Passenger Association, he's always advocating for dual modes and being able to move between the electrified portions of the system and non-electrified portions and.
I mean, just not even dual modes. That's what they did. Like Acela was the first time that New Haven to Boston had been electrified. Yeah. And so every single Northeast Corridor train prior to that point had a power change in New Haven. Right. There's already a strong precedent for this within my lifetime.
Right. Yeah, all sorts of options. I think kind of the way that I read it is that at some point, and this kind of started taking off in the early 90s, is they got hooked into the idea of this high-speed rail network. And that was kind of supposed to be the foundation of everything else. So I think maybe they got stuck on that idea rather than, they were going to put down this 800-mile system, and that was going to be that. And, they were going to get it done in 25 years for $50 billion or whatever. And so...
Only 25 years, only $50 billion.
Yeah, the expectations were unrealistic. And I think the rest kind of led from that. Whereas if the cost and amount of time that it was going to take had been realistic and we still endeavored to do that, then maybe we would have looked at things a little bit more incrementally and, tried to build the whole network up simultaneously rather than rely on this foundation. But, that's where we're at now.
This actually leads into one of the questions that I was going to ask you about the different styles of high-speed rail. For example, the French TGV network, which is much more, and I learned this was very interesting to me. So being very familiar with regular old-fashioned trains, there's a lot of seat turnover. So the whole San Francisco to Chicago, California Zephyr, it doesn't primarily exist for the people taking land cruises over 2 days from Chicago to San Francisco. It exists for the people going Chicago to St. Louis to Omaha, Omaha to Denver, Denver to Salt Lake, and then Salt Lake to San Francisco. I could maybe throw in a Reno in there. And so there's a lot of seat turnover across the length of the line, and the way that the trains are ticketed and operated is designed to work with that. France doesn't have that. And so if there are intermediate stops on a lot of the TGVs, they just deboard half the passengers, and then that's that. The train runs half empty to the next stop on the line.
Right.
And they're also very isolated from the train network. Whenever they have stations in the same towns, the old legacy slow trains are in the center of town. But the TGV stations are lampooned for being, quote, stations in a field, a 20 or so minute bus ride away from the town for which the station is named, negating some of the speed advantages of the TGV in the first place. And it seems like, from what you're describing, that California High-Speed Rail is kind of thought of in the French style of a completely de novo, isolated line that doesn't have... I mean, there are intermodal connections, but they're not like track connections to have continuing services.
Yeah, to some extent. I think the way that they've envisioned it is sort of like the Northeast Corridor. Mm-hmm. But think of the way that the Northeast Corridor hooks into everything south to D.C. Mm-hmm. Or even at New Haven with Connecticut, or even Boston at Boston South. So yeah, I mean, a lot like the NEC, where they're thinking about, they would have various services like that on a pretty beefy trunk.
But then they're not like using the existing.
You have to transfer out. Yeah. Like the NEC, you would be hooking up at the same station, so it wouldn't be like the French model where kind of bypassing the city. I don't think I've had a lot of discussions about this since I started doing the channel, because when I started doing the channel, I didn't really know anything about high-speed rail, ironically enough. This is the irony of Lucid Stew, where I really just put out these 2 videos to complain about California high-speed rail.
He's referencing here his original 2 videos on HSR, which launched him from a gaming about gaming channel to an HSR channel. And I went back and I rewatched them recently, and for being your first ever videos on HSR, I think you hit the nail bang on the head in the very first ever move you did on the subject.
Yeah, thank you. I did know a little bit about California high-speed rail itself. I didn't really know anything about high-speed rail as a broader subject. I knew the danger I was getting into because I know how people are that like trains.
Be careful, I resemble that remark.
Right. That is still a giant fear of mine because, it's been this ongoing education process for me, and that was one of the objectives of the channel, to learn as much as I could about the subject so that the videos got better over time. But I know that people are into trains and have been into trains for decades and decades and obsess on the minutia and know the facts inside and out. So, I have to always try to remain humble because there will always be someone out there to humble you if you don't. Yeah, with the 2 initial videos, I knew a fair amount about California high-speed rail, and I knew the financial situation. And a lot of the people that I got into arguments with online just kind of wanted to push that aside and ignore that. But it's really important because it is the thing that is defining the project now. And so they reached a point where when Gavin Newsom got into office, he started talking about, okay, LA to San Francisco isn't really realistic at the moment. Let's figure out something that we can do. And they came up with Merced to Bakersfield. Regardless of how anyone feels about that particular decision, that's what they decided to do. And the premise at the time was, okay, we've got the funding to do this. We can accomplish this, and this will kind of be like a starting point and a demonstrator. And once people see this, they'll see how great it is and they'll want more. And that will kind of be the basis.
And by people, you mean the 5% of California's population.
Right. But, also, I have talked to a lot of people who from all over the country and even the world, they intend to come out and see this thing running when it's open. So I think a lot of people will be exposed to it, not just people in the Central Valley. So, fingers crossed when they do actually get it running, hopefully it is a great experience and runs fantastic and everyone says, wow, this is great, we should do more. But yeah, so the whole premise was we had the funding to do that, and so that's what we can do. We can get something up and running. Let's go ahead and do it. And then with the 2022 business plan, they announced that they didn't have the money to do that anymore. And then it's like, okay, now we're in a tough spot because if we can't finish Merced to Bakersfield, then we don't really have anything. And that was the whole purpose of those 2 videos. My perspective of the project, the way that I come at it is I'm interested in infrastructure, I'm interested in things that are built, I'm interested in technology. I know a lot of people who are more interested in transit or the environment or things like that. For me, it's cool trains and, like flyover ramps and that type of stuff that I'm most interested in. So I just wanted to put out something that let as many people as I could contact know that we decided to do this. We voted on this. And so we either should or shouldn't. Let's figure out what we're doing here because we're on a road to not doing it. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to kind of lay all that bare where like, this is the situation, we're not going to get this done now, whether you like it or not, that's what needs to be done to fund it. So let's decide what we're going to do, get it funded, get it built, and let's write it. And then the channel just kind of blossomed from there. The viewership on those 2 videos was way more than I expected. I was thinking maybe like 3,000 views or something like that. And the first one's almost like 18,000.
As I recall from your previous videos on games design, it was a full extra 0 change.
Yeah, well, I had videos that were 15, 20,000 views before, so it wasn't a shock. But just in terms of what my expectations were versus what happened, like, I'm looking at the viewership coming in like a week later, I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And then people in the comments were just saying, like, you should do more of these. And I was like, okay, I mean, I don't know anything about this subject. I know how you guys are about facts and all that, so, bear with me and I'll work on it. And then I kept doing it, and it kept rolling on so far.
Yeah, the autism train internet niche seems to be a pretty lucrative one. Since you were just now bringing up Brightline, I'm assuming you've heard of the recent bond downgrading that Brightline has gotten. How do you think that that's going to affect anything? Even Florida, I can't imagine them completely abandoning the project when it was just so recently built. Do you think it's just going to become like basically a government-run transit system plus or minus a few extra steps with a ton of subsidies, or does this imperil Brightline West's building as well?
It definitely imperils their building, because they're in a situation right now where they don't have any cash, so they're not able to spend money on any sort of expansion. That's why, like, the stations in Stewart and Cocoa, they're waiting on the government to handle that, because they don't want to spend any money on it. As far as their solvency goes, their corporate structure ultimately is backed up by, I don't remember the country, but it's one of the Persian Gulf sovereign wealth funds. Ultimately, that's where it leads. And their main purpose really is, as far as I understand it, real estate development along the line, and the train exists to support that. So I think ultimately there's a backstop there. Okay. Like, they'll probably get bailed out by one of their parent companies if worse comes to worse. If not, like, you can have Amtrak step in, but
well, I would look at Texas Rail, Texas High Speed Rail.
Right.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate loss, because even Amtrak has never run directly between Dallas and Houston.
Yeah, Amtrak it's kind of its own barrel of monkeys. I know everyone has their opinions about it and their experiences with it, good and bad. But the unfortunate thing about Amtrak is that it's political. It's kind of like how I always lampoon Texans against high-speed rail. It's like, how can you be against a mode of travel? It's like Texans against bicyclists.
Texans against a successful economy.
Right.
Amtrak has always had a place in my heart, I guess just simply by obligation because choo-choos.
Right.
But the older I've gotten and the more I've explored with it, and also explored abroad, the gently more impressed with it that I am. First off, as somebody who likes high-speed rail, if ever you have a chance, you have to ride Acela first class, because okay. I have ridden ÖBB in Austria and SBB in Switzerland, some of the highest quality rail providers in the world, arguably. And Acela's first class service, I think, is almost on par with what Europe can do. And it's not just the onboard service elements, it's also how they dispatch the trains. So whenever there are any delays or disruptions to the Northeast Corridor, in a true old-fashioned first-class dispatching of yore, they actually let the Acela skip in front of all of the other delayed trains to keep the Acela as close to on time as possible. And this is heartening to think, because for all of Acela's issues of late, it says that even we, the failing states of America, can get at least one thing mostly right. And if we can get it mostly right here, there's a chance it can happen elsewhere. But as far as the rest of Amtrak goes, I think you're right that it's just largely political. So to get here, I took the Texas Eagle down from Chicago and then the Sunset Limited over. And so I actually did get to ride that HRSR corridor between Chicago and St. Louis. Regular speed rail tops out at 130 kilometers per hour or 80 miles per hour. HRSR, or higher speed rail, uses conventional diesel-electric train sets, but up to 200 kilometers per hour or 125 miles per hour, whereas true HSR, or high-speed rail, is electric trains above 200 kilometers an hour. Although the precise definition varies from country to country, and sometimes even between different U.S. states, these delineations are generally accurate.
Okay.
And that was under 5 hours, even with the long, heavy, long-distance train set. And then, because it's an overnight to Texas, we then went to sleep just as we crossed over into Arkansas. 8.5 hours later, during breakfast, we were still in Arkansas.
Painfully slow, yeah.
Exactly. And so it was astonishing just how clear the difference was. The moment we crossed the border into the next state, that's when everything fell apart.
Yeah, those are long distance, so maybe it's because I think Lincoln Service is state supported. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the difference. And the trains out here are not fantastic, but they're pretty good. Mm-hmm. Pacific Surfliner has the third highest ridership, in the entire country, and highest if you exclude the Northeast Corridor. And it's not great. The one time I rode it, for instance, we were about a mile from the Ventura station, and there's a single track portion where we had to wait for a train coming the other direction to pass first before we could pull into the station. Mm-hmm. And it was this absurd situation where we waited so long that you could have gotten off the train and walked to the station faster. So, it has its problems, but there are also sections where it goes 90 miles an hour, and the time between LA and San Diego, for instance, isn't terrible, and a lot of people ride it, and it's useful. And it's kind of the same situation with Capital Corridor service and San Joaquin's, where, as far as ridership goes, they do pretty well. And, it's a decent service for a certain amount of people. So I can see where Amtrak kind of succeeds sometimes, and, I definitely know about its problems. Another story would be like my parents took the Southwest Chief to Chicago one time. They had a roomette or something like that. The toilet went out in it. It was a big disaster. It was like the trip from hell.
I literally was just reading Amtrak's 2024 on-time performance. I think the Southwest Chief had a 23% OTP.
Nice.
It's the worst of the long-distance routes at the moment. But then conversely, on the flip side, the Empire Builder had a few years when it had better OTP than the Acela.
Uh-huh.
Who would have thought? I guess it's just really the host railroad, and Union Pacific is the true enemy of us all.
Yeah. Canadian Pacific, Kansas City, that's the one that you want. They're the good one. All the rest kind of struggle a little bit.
You were talking about the Surfliner with bottlenecks. So I guess going all the way back to the discussion of French TGV, or the French style of completely separate from legacy rail, high-speed rail. I've only recently, in the past, I think 2 years, ever since exploring it properly for the first time, started to learn about the German high-speed rail strategy of doing things, which is very much the incrementalist perspective. Yeah. And I think it even took until the late 90s or early 2000s for them to build their first single independent high-speed rail route. It's like a Frankfurt Fulda, a Fulda Kissel, something like that. Close. Germany's first HSR routes began construction shortly after the French LGV project began, but took a little longer to complete, opening in 2 segments in 1991 between Hanover and Würzburg and Mannheim and Stuttgart. However, because Germany had a stronger legacy of passenger rail and didn't rampantly prune lines through the 50s and 60s like France, the UK, and, of course, the US, these HSR routes were not standalone, but instead used as fast-forwards of routes connecting to existing passenger train lines. So the first actual Intercity Express, or ICE, route ran north-south, because, there was a little bit of an east-west split there for a few years, from Hamburg to Hanover on conventional rail, Hanover to Kassel and Fulda on the first new HSR line, Fulda to Frankfurt am Main and Mannheim on existing rail, Mannheim to Stuttgart on the other new HSR line, and finally conventional rail again for the last leg from Stuttgart to München. Sure, these were incredible feats of engineering, totaling to nearly 430 greenfield route kilometers with 76 tunnels and almost 400 bridges, and costing almost 20 billion euros in today's money. But most of the time what they do is they just incrementally take the existing trains, find the slowest 20 miles an hour, speed that up, find the next slowest 40 miles, do a bypass around that, and then bit by bit change the existing train into the high-speed train. And of course that has its own upsides and downsides, but I guess excluding Chicago to St. Louis, I really don't think anybody else is talking about that here in the US. Do you think that's a viable HSR strategy?
Well, we've got that unique situation where just the vast majority of the network is owned by private companies. Mm-hmm. And in order to pull anything like that off, you're going to need their cooperation at the moment.
Well, they can usually get things out of it. Like, for example, Norfolk Southern was actually the private company that suggested the Second Pennsylvanian, saying, hey, we'll allow you a separate train slot if you give us all this state money to build these extra crossovers.
Right.
There are ways to make it happen.
Yeah, I think it's possible. And, we have examples here for California high-speed rail, the way that they're talking about moving between LA and Anaheim. That's not going to be high speed, but what they want to do is they want to add a fourth track on the Southern Transcon between Fullerton and Redondo Junction.
Okay.
And then they're going to put wires over everything.
Oh.
Which normally when you think of freights and we're talking about electrifying the biggest freight corridor there is around here, that should be an incongruity, right? But there's a possibility they might go along with that. And that would be an interesting paradigm for the rest of the country.
I should note, in the intervening months, Lucid Stew put out a video render of the CAHSR route from LA to Anaheim, linked in the show notes.
In that regard, if that's possible, then yeah, I think, we have so much rail in this country, and some of it's pretty good for higher speed travel. If you can find your bypasses and your places where you can speed up, then that's certainly one way of doing it. But we have to shift paradigms to get there. And I may have relented too early on my channel, on my content, where my assumption is that that's not going to happen, and let's look at other ways, like using interstate corridors to get that done. But this is one thing I always keep in mind, is you never know what's going to happen. When we start, when we're talking about these projects, we're talking about 30 or 40-year timelines from conception to execution. And that's a long time. That's a long time politically. Lots of things change. If you just think about, the way politics was 40 years ago and the way politics was 40 years before that, huge leaps in the way that we think about things. So that's one thing I always try to keep in mind when I'm trying to, say what is going to happen out on a long time scale is maybe within 20 years you can figure it out. But beyond that, it starts getting real hazy because things change pretty quick.
Interesting. So first, I guess what I'm hearing is that maybe the incrementalist HSR approach is kind of similar to the low and go full build out, in that they just simply fall prey to the same problems. And then also, I guess, with politics at the moment, do you think HSR as a concept is still viable, or will it only ever crawl along at California paces?
Right. One thing I learned jumping into the subject was it's been fits and starts from the get-go. They started really talking about it in earnest when the Japanese came out with the Shinkansen for the Olympics in '64. And then it's just kind of been this tug-of-war between Democrats and Republicans, sort of jumping to the fore and then being pulled back. I think to the current paradigm, we made a pretty good leap during the Clinton administration, but then, of course, Bush followed that, and generally it's been Democrats are pro-rail and Republicans they're not necessarily anti-rail, but they're just not as enthused about it, and probably opposed in some instances as well. And then, kind of the same thing with the Obama administration when they came in. I think we had a pretty good leap there. My problem with Democrats on the subject is that there's more rhetoric than action.
I agree.
And so I think if Democrats had provided adequate funding for high-speed rail during the Obama administration, we'd be having a different conversation right now.
Not a trickle of $500 million at a time.
Yeah. So instead of California high-speed rail getting $3 billion, how about we give California high-speed rail $10 billion or something like that? And so I think if that had been the case at the time, and we removed some of the stipulations that ended up causing problems, where the authority felt like they had to leap into this before they were ready in order to keep that grant money, then there's an outside chance trains would be running right now, because originally they wanted the iOS to be functioning now. Yeah, so it's hindsight is 20/20, of course, but it's kind of, we have the same problem in the state of California, where our politics are dominated by Democrats. They have all the power, and they're still not handling it. That's because I think rhetorically it sounds good, but politically maybe they don't want to stick their neck out to really, really back it up, because it is an expensive project and there are other things to spend the money on. And this is another thing that I always try to think about as a consideration, is the opportunity cost, where you can say that you don't care about how much it costs, you can say that it doesn't matter how much it costs, but there's always something else that you can spend the money on, and there are people who are going to support that first. And so politics is a reality whether you like it or not, you know.
Do you think, and maybe this is getting just a little too fanciful, but I've always wondered how much of it is maybe not even necessarily political as much as it is de facto American car brain. Like, rail in Caltrans's budget is still like one of the smallest segments.
Yeah.
Even if highway expansions aren't happening as rampantly as they were before, it's still that the major amount of money just flows straight to the highway. Like, I'm thinking of, back when I lived here, Carmageddon, the 405 was shut down, and they spent, over $100 million per mile, and over $1 billion total. And at the end of the project, travel times increased by 1 minute.
Right. Yeah.
But nobody blinks at that. Nobody looks at those projects with the same scrutiny as they do HSR things.
Right.
Is it just partially that we as Americans have been so accustomed to cars and suburbs and whatnot that it's like, oh no, it doesn't matter how much it costs, build the highway, build the lanes. Oh, but that one extra track of HSR, maybe we...
Yeah, I think so to some extent. You know, and some of that's just human nature, where you prefer what you know, and what you don't know is a little bit uncomfortable. So I think that's definitely part of it. Going back to what I was saying about freeway expansion and political realities in California is, and this is another reason that I took an interest in the subject, is because I live the limitations of sprawl. I grew up in it. There are twice as many people out here as when I was a kid. Just as an example, I thought about this coming on the freeway on the way, because the freeway was actually pretty clear. Yeah, that's not always the case. There are definitely places in Southern California where it doesn't matter what time of day it is, you're going to run into traffic. But we are here in Redlands. We are 65, 70 miles from Los Angeles, which is the core of the greater area. So we're pretty far out. And the reality is that, you know, in the morning and in the evening, if you try to go up and down that hill between Redlands and Yucaipa, you're going to hit traffic.
So there are even people further away that are commuting.
Oh, sure. That's because, you know, they started building a bunch of houses out in Yucaipa and that area, and so you got to get from there to here, and just the nature of the road network is, you know, you're not necessarily going from Yucaipa to LA. You might be going from Yucaipa to San Bernardino or Yucaipa to Riverside, but, you know, all of those, that infinite origin and infinite destination model, but with only about 5 or 6 pipes to get from everywhere to everywhere, it has its limitations. And so in response to that, sprawl wants to keep pushing out, but then you get this kind of wacky situation where you end up with traffic way far out. So another example is, if you go past Yucaipa, you end up in the Sanji Pass, which leads out to Coachella Valley, which leads out to the desert. We're talking 70, 80, 90 miles from Los Angeles. They just added an extra lane to the freeway out through Yucaipa a few years back. They're building a bunch of tract homes out in Banning, which is in the pass. It's like 85 miles from LA. And now there's traffic between Banning and Yucaipa.
Who would have thought?
Yeah, just over and over and over again, no matter how far you push out, because the freeway system has limits. And I'm living that, I'm in it, and the realization there, even though I drive pretty much everywhere, the realization there is, if the state's going to keep growing, there's got to be a different way of moving people around, because what are we going to do? Have Palm Springs as a suburb of LA? It doesn't make any sense. It's at some point it gets absurd.
I simply have to ask, are you at all a fan of Jason Slaughter and Not Just Bikes? Would you consider yourself orange-pilled?
You know what? I've seen tiny little portions of some of those videos, but I really haven't watched them too in depth. I know that he moved to the Netherlands,
yep,
right? And he likes to talk about how his quality of life is a lot better since then. I know that much. I don't know a ton about the videos. I'm always careful about comparing the two, because I think we get in a situation sometimes in the U.S. where we look to Europe and look at Europe as better, when in my opinion it's just different. And I think we can have a situation that works for us that is different than the situation that works for Europe, because we are different than Europeans. We're culturally different than Europeans. I think we can look to them for inspiration. I think we can look for them to see what things they've done that work for them, and maybe a little bit of twist, we can implement that here, and it will work for us. But I'm always, careful about lamenting about how we're not Europe, or wishing that we were Europe, because we're not. That's just a reality of it. This is what we're dealing with out here, with all the cars driving around and pretty much no one taking the train, is a reality that we have to deal with, and we want to morph that. No one can see this, but a couple blocks over there talking about tearing the mall down, the old mall down, and building a bunch of apartments over there. They're talking about redeveloping this area right around the station. And so there are definitely things that we can do, and some of those lessons we probably learned from Europe, but Redlands is never going to be Amsterdam.
Yeah, so. It's too dry, not enough water.
I mean, though, Lucid, if you're open to it, I'm willing to go halvesies with you on a rogue canal dredger. We don't have to get it municipally funded or approved if we just have enough evil US billionaire energy.
So my sister, she actually went to grad school in Zurich, in Switzerland, and I went to grad school in State College, Pennsylvania. So the Rust Belt. I feel like my career is moving in the wrong direction. But going over there, it was so interesting, at least to me, because especially the trains in Switzerland, they're not fast. They have very limited high-speed rail, and that is something that they are trying to resolve. Trying to build like HSR trunks across the country so that people can get from Milan to Germany or Toulouse to Vienna a little faster. But so the old stereotype of the New York City subway. There are lots of problems with New York, lots of racism baked in, structural poverty, but everybody rides the subway. You have the rich and the poor. I once had that stereotypical New York moment when I boarded a train car, and there was my landlord over there. He was the rich person who had like tons of properties, and I was like the tiny person who was renting the studio apartment, but we were both on the same train. That was kind of how it was with intercity trains in Switzerland. Of course, like first and second class, and so the bougier people wanting a quieter environment went into first class. But it really was, it's not just that I appreciated like the culture that they had, it was more that the problems that we face have been solved. I'm touching the train, I'm riding it right now. There's a better way out there. It's not like Hyperloop or maglevs or, I don't know, rocket boots or something. That's always a function of science fiction and perpetually the future and never the now. It's more that there's existing technology that's running right now. If we just had the gumption to pick it up and move it. And I mean, to a tiny, tiny extent, we have Swiss-built vehicles that are approaching quickly behind us. So, oh, no. So it was the funniest thing. So the first time I ever rode TexRail was back in like 2022, I think. I had just a few months before gotten back from visiting my sister in Switzerland, and TexRail then had just opened up like a few years earlier. And it was so trippy, riding the same train, listening to the same motor hum, the station announcements were in the same electronic voice, the buttons on the doors were the same, but then it was ever so rude when you pressed the button, it opened up onto the Texas suburbs instead of the Swiss Alps. It was so strange. So that's one of the reasons why I like DMUs, I guess, a little bit, is because they offer like one of the lowest cost ways to build modern transit. And that of course means they're lower quality, much more single tracking, much more infrequent, much lower capacity, just overall slower. But it's not that it's a cheaper way to build transit, it's more that it lowers the bar to entry to make transit projects viable, rail transit especially, that wouldn't be otherwise. And so visiting Switzerland kind of radicalized me. I'm remembering specific. Oh goodness, I wish I remember the neighborhood. So back when we lived in Rancho Palos Verdes, we would have to drive to do like a Boy and Girl Scouts into one of like the more inland neighborhoods, like filled with warehouses. And there's this one freight train track that got a freight train once a week. But when you hit it, it would be like a 15-20 minute slow-moving train. But otherwise, it was extremely underutilized. Like, the tracks stood there unused 6.5 out of every 7 days. But if you could do something like this, where you could have modern transit for nary more than the cost of the vehicles and a couple of thousand cubic yards of concrete for the platforms, then all of a sudden you can take those existing underutilized urban freight rail corridors and then do stuff like this with it.
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of the irony with this train here is that, we have a ready-made solution here. It's kind of a weird little train. I don't know if it's being implemented all that well at the moment.
I would say no.
But, we go from that to talking about the same thing running on hydrogen for 50% more for no particular reason. And that also kind of, I think, gets into the argument of trains are pretty efficient as far as energy and CO2 goes compared to cars. So do we really need to electrify, or can we expand diesel electric service and get more people off the road that way and cut back on carbon that way instead of the more capital intensive version of electrifying everything? So I think that's also an interesting argument to be had.
You say that, and if I'm correct, I think that vehicle...
The Stadler-Flirt DMU on the Metrolink Arrow, which, mind you, has capacity for nearly 200 people.
It has about the same gas mileage as a Hummer. The whole thing does.
Yeah.
It's just simply the rolling resistance efficiency of steel on steel instead of deforming rubber on asphalt.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, they're running a couple of 10-cylinder diesel Cummins engines in there, so it's literally just like 2 full-size trucks.
Yeah, so I actually, when I was in TexRail, I showed one of the conductors the pictures that I'd taken, and he actually gave me a tour of the vehicle. He like unhinged all of the cabinets on the side of the power pack. He took me into the, and this was something I didn't know. So the operator's cab, of course, has the door. There's actually a little hallway that you have to walk down behind the door, and then there are cabinets on either side that contain like the server racks and the air brake systems and so on and so forth. So these actually, they only have 2 Cummins diesel engines, even though they have slots for 4. And so as you add more cars, what they do is these have the 2 engines. The ones in TexRail, they have the 3rd engine and then 1 empty space, and then the Silver Line, which is going to open up soon, kind of in the north suburbs of Dallas, that's going to have all 4 of them. Right. And so you can kind of like tailor the power capacity to the vehicle's requirements.
Yeah, and these are only 2 cars, but the capacity on these is probably 150, 160 people.
You might appreciate this. So it's like the ABA setup with the B being the power pack. Colloquially in transit parlance, they're called 2 rooms and a bath.
Yeah, that's funny because I have walked through the bathroom before, and that was an experience. If anyone gets a chance to ride these things, you got to walk through the corridor between the cars because it feels like some sort of weird amusement ride or something, like a fun house.
Yeah, that sounds about right. If you want, we can get into the model railroading side of the interview, or I'm certain we could just keep talking about HSR for like 10, 11 more hours. I just have to say, now that I'm here in person with you are, I genuinely do think of you as a journalist. The quality of content and the meticulousness of the research that you put out, and then also with just the regularity, too. I can barely manage 1 podcast episode a month, and here you are doing like almost 1 a week, and then 1 full-on reporting thing a month.
Yeah, my objective is once a week. I'm not there yet. I wish I was. Well, first of all, with some of these documents, they're so dry that no one reads them. So just by default of choosing to read them, I just happen to be the first person that sees them, I guess.
You've genuinely broken some stories before.
Yeah, I think before I started talking about it, most people who are aware of it now probably weren't aware of the High Desert Corridor. And, a couple of times I've contacted Brightline West and they've given me some information that no one else was talking about. California High-Speed Rail is another one. I don't know if I've broken any stories, but because one of their objectives is to keep the project going, they tend to kind of obfuscate the reality of the project a little bit. And so if you're willing to peel away a couple of the layers of the onion and look at it a little bit deeper, you get a perspective that they don't want you to get, which is a little bit closer to reality. So if you want to call that journalism, I'll take it.
We've been moving away from like the New York Times and the Washington Post. So long as Vox exists, why can't Lucid Studios exist?
Right, exactly. Journalism isn't what it used to be either. It's definitely changing and morphing, but professional journalism also, I think, has become over-reliant on revenue and clicks and tension, and they've lost kind of some of the depth that made that form a little bit more worthwhile.
That's why I cannot recommend enough The Guardian, Bloomberg, and CityCast, as they are the last and bestest bastions for such content. The Washington Post used to be that way, but fuck Bezos. Actually, fun fact, the people who made WAPO into the paper with the tagline Democracy Dies in Darkness before Bezos ruined everything are in fact the same people behind creating CityCast. So, yet another reason to listen to your nearest CityCast podcast.
And this is what I experience when I'm doing research, is a lot of time they just don't look that step deeper that is kind of sometimes required for a story, because they just don't have the time. They got to throw up the story like that to get in first. And I think that's where other people like me can step in.
Can I ask a question? Does either of you know if there is a ticket vending machine, or is it over there?
Right there.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
He managed to ask the most well-informed people on the matter in town. Maybe I can even actually throw in a few comments and start a cross-country conversation. So the last person that I interviewed on this cross-country trip, Tyler Trahan, who is a railroad heritage and education expert over in Philadelphia, he actually had very similar thoughts. He postulated some things that made me kind of rethink journalism.
Oops, sorry about that. I'll get around to editing Tyler's interview part 2 as soon as I have a chance. I guess you're going to get the Christopher Nolan wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey version of this discussion instead. Sorry about that.
The way that he put it was that newspapers way back in the day were effectively the internet, because there was so little a way to connect with people outside of just like letters, and he kind of already had to know where you were sending them to. There was no forums, no Facebook, no Discord. The purpose of the newspapers was just simply to inform people. That was, instead of paying Xfinity for your internet service, you paid your local Times for their newspaper, and that is what ended up informing you. And as the world has changed, as the internet was invented, that kind of obviated the need for just true 5 W's, who, what, where, when, why, just the facts ma'am style reporting.
Yeah.
And nowadays people, like as you're saying, people want a little bit more nuance and interpretation, even if it's stepping away from just pure facts just a little bit more. But since the content of legacy journalism is so dry, they kind of have to chase likes and clicks and whatnot because it's so boring otherwise. Instead of updating the style of reporting, they're trying to put band-aids on the flesh wounds.
Well, and also I think a lot of quote-unquote reporting has kind of evolved into editorials. And so I think a lot of the time you get someone's opinion rather necessarily than the facts. And a lot of the time the opinion just happens to line up with the opinion that you want to hear because you've chosen a certain outlet. And so I think a certain amount of people have gotten tired of that and want to hear a little bit more information. I totally recognize it's completely impossible to eliminate bias. I still do offer some opinion in my news stuff and throw my perspective in there from time to time. Some definitely a little bit of sarcasm. I'm not in a political party, so I generally oppose both parties, and that helps me out a little bit, I think, in being able to take on the various politicians that are kind of holding up the whole thing, where, like, I don't have an allegiance there. So if it's a Democrat that is part of the problem, I'm ready to call that out, whether, instead of maybe having some reservations about that because I don't want to go against the party or something like that. Same thing with Republicans. Republicans, me and you have got a problem in Texas for sure, but I'm not from Texas, so that's fine.
Just so long as they build rail transit.
Right, it's like...
I once introduced myself to my local congressperson as a choo-choo fascist. I believe everybody deserves rights except for the ones in the way of where I want to put my trains.
Right.
They were silent for a moment or two after that.
Yeah, Texas is such a unique place within this sphere. I mean, the larger metros seem to be down for it, but then outside of that, the state is really kind of opposed to the idea, which is sort of unique. Like most other places in the United States, there's the recognition that intercity rail really does have a place to serve some population, but Texas is like, nah, we don't need that. Just put in another freeway.
Yeah, it's a very strange state. And then you've been following the SEPTA crisis, right?
A little bit.
Yeah, so obviously this is my home territory, so it was kind of a really big thing in the state at the moment.
Right.
So it's a split House and Senate. The House is in favor of funding SEPTA, which, mind you, is already like the most underfunded rail transit agency in the country. And it really shows with vehicles that are 20 to 40 years old,
Right.
mostly low-level platforms, and then 5 steps up, even though they auspiciously allow bicycles on board every train.
Right.
If you have to heft it up to a height higher than your head through a chute barely wider than your shoulders, it's like, come on, guys, build a high-level platform or just say no bicycles at the station.
Right.
Anyway, so the Senate, though, is currently controlled by Republicans. In Pennsylvania, because of its very old history, there are a ton of small towns just scattered all throughout the state, and so it has like a higher rural small town to big city percentage.
Right.
And especially of late, there's been a culture war between the two of them.
Right.
And the person who's in charge of the Senate, who's refusing to allow them to approve a budget for SEPTA, he's from the very creatively named Indiana, Pennsylvania.
Yes. Welcome to California, by the way.
Well, what is it? Renewable energy. It's a fart-powered car.
Right.
Sorry. But the way that he's couching it is not in a matter of wasting government money or tax dollars, efficiency, or whatnot. He's really just trying to stick it to the cities because they exist and are successful, and his town is shrinking in population, along with, the other one, California, Pennsylvania, and I think there's also a Wyoming, Pennsylvania. So I don't know how that happened, but it did.
Right. Yeah. Kind of a microcosm of the nation there, where eventually this guy will leave.
Yes, you're right. And people like this will die off. It's like, I'm not necessarily opposed to small towns myself. I mean, hell, I lived in one for 8 years. Okay, it's a 150,000 person college town, so it's a really big small town, but it is like farmers' fields on all sides. I could walk to a farmer's field in half an hour. But it's annoying to me how there is this sort of culture war, especially when trains
Are more correct.
serve to benefit like rural places as well, because in so many of the towns that Amtrak serves, it's a lifeline. The places are too small to have an airport, and if they do have an airport, it's like an extra $700 premium on top of the ticket because the planes are so infrequently used there. But with a train, you can just stop it anywhere and then just put down a step box and a station you have.
Well, it's kind of this, for me politically, it's kind of this bizarre idea of why should I pay for something that doesn't benefit me? One way or another, we're all one polity and we are in this together. And everyone can probably think of an instance where they use something that has to do with government where they benefit more than they're paying in. I'm sure there are people listening where that's not the case, or maybe they make a lot of money and they're just paying in more no matter what.
Rich people listening to my podcast? Thank you for your faith in me, Stu, but I think I scared them all off already with the rhetoric of a violent socialist takeover.
But, that's just the way that we operate. We're supposed to help each other. We're supposed to be good citizens. The degree to which you want to take that, okay, that's up for debate. But just the idea that it's everyone for themselves and we don't help each other out is... I don't think that's the way that our form of government works.
Or that any form could work successfully.
Yeah. You're going back to the Middle Ages there. Yeah, that type of perspective I don't really understand, where unless you get something out of it, you're automatically opposed to it. I don't get it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. It's definitely not a boring time to be alive.
Yeah, politics is very interesting. One thing that we've been going through this, and we're dealing with this in California, we've been going through this gerrymandering stuff. I was looking the other day, I just happened to stumble across this map that was showing the shift in electoral votes to the southeast. And basically we've had this migration over the last 20 years from blue metropolitan areas mostly to red states. And as a result, when the 2030 census kicks over, Republicans are probably going to gain about 10 or 12 seats in the House. And so I think what you're seeing right now with all the gerrymandering efforts is trying to find a bridge between now, where they still just barely have power, and 2030, when they're going to have just a tiny bit tighter grasp on that. And so I think what that's really about in the short term is trying to bridge between those and hold the house just in the next 4 years.
Okay, this is interesting. I'm familiar with the map he's referencing, but I think I'll take a slightly different view. While I'm certain he's right that California and Texas's gerrymandering is a dick-waving competition, and while I'm no fan of the Democrats, as their present-day positions now seem to reflect more those of 1980s Republicans, I think I can actually draw it back to urbanism, and, dare I say it, be hopeful about it. In an article I believe entitled "The Democrats Are Committing Particide" by Jerusalem Demsis in The Atlantic, it was observed that the main reason why people were fleeing primarily California and the Northeast was not policies, nor jobs, nor even culture wars, but simply housing affordability. Unfortunately, blue states were on the very early front of environmental movements and were overly influenced by conservative and neoliberal hippies, aka boomers, who had and maintain an errant idea of lawns being nature and big projects being industrial and polluting, even if said projects actually help climate emissions. Thus were blue strongholds locked into anti-density suburban nightmares by overly burdensome environmental regulations with huge loopholes carved for cars and not much else, which, while successfully executing on so many other things like the economy and inclusivity, nonetheless became prohibitively unaffordable due to a shortage of realistic housing and an overabundance of overly expensive and stupid-looking single-family homes. As such, while I will say that anti-trans and therefore anti-human rights Gavin Newsom's play at gerrymandering is to keep California's Democratic seats safe, I will also note that, in general, people have been moving away from blue states not to red states, but to cities in red states. Greg Nazi Abbott's ploy at redistricting Texas is similarly not necessarily for a national red v blue 4D chess game, but instead because, left unchecked, Texas will go blue soon enough due to the growth and success of its cities, not its nowheres. Nationally, less than a fifth of all Americans are rural, and over the entire course of U.S. history, that number has only ever dropped. While I am solidly not a fan of the future prospects of the U.S., not just as a nation, but as a concept, that so many red states have rapidly growing cities and shrinking rural small towns, that cities are almost epistemologically blue because it requires you to acknowledge and accommodate your fellow humans, and that urbanism seems to be almost universally ascendant, if nascent, in nearly every city on the globe, and especially even here, with, hell, Omaha building a streetcar, Dallas doubling its DMUs, Tampa improving its transit, and even the geonym Detroit itself succumbing to the inevitable tide of walkability, bike infrastructure, and rail transit. I see, in the long run, car dependence, rural lifestyles, and conservatism, as it's defined today, on an absolutely inescapable path towards atrophy. Sure, Stu is right. California is losing population and apportionment, but for every Tennessee, there's a Nashville. For every Mississippi, there's an Amtrak Mardi Gras. And for every California high-speed rail, there's a Brightline. As well as, for every bomb the U.S. gives Israel, there's yet another young person who's proudly anti-Semitic, and for every tradwife airhead influencer, there's another genderqueer youth. I guess to walk back my despondence earlier, I still do believe that the arc of history does bend towards justice, at least on the very, very, very longest of timescales. Things will be okay in the end, it's just that I myself am aggressively mad at and in no way want to support a country of people who are proactively preventing things from being okay now. I would kill to ride high-speed rail, but at the moment that means not fighting for more of it here in the future, but punishing those who prevented it either through negligent carbrain or proactive malice, and moving elsewhere to experience at least any amount of high-speed rail within my natural lifespan. Is that a little more nuanced? Does that make a little more sense? Or am I just rambling? Either way, Lucid Stew felt the same about wanting to assert his third-party creds.
I don't know where I was going with that, but I just wanted to get that in. But, kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier with politics, and how that's going to influence how high-speed rail works is, if that bridge does happen, if that does work out for the Republicans and they do manage to hold on to power through potentially, mid-2030s or something like that, that might be some trouble. Like if it's extended, just because the projects are so long range, they are at least 20, 30 years from the idea to getting it into action. If you have 20 or 30 years of opposition government there, then it just won't happen. And so there, I think, is a danger that could squelch some things that I think are really worth doing, like in the questions that you sent me. you were asking about like the favorite project in Europe, but my favorite project overall is in the United States, and that's between Atlanta and Charlotte. And that's because, the Southeast is the fastest growing area in the country. And like I was talking about before, if you can get those systems in before the growth, you can absorb some of that and keep some of that extra sprawl from happening.
Mm-hmm. And then also build the culture to start of riding trains.
Yeah, exactly. And here's another one that I get a lot of time in my comments is like, we should build transit first before we build the high-speed rail. But that also works in reverse, where if you have the high-speed rail in place, that is going to encourage your transit planning. Mm-hmm. So it kind of works both ways. I think it can go both ways too. But the reason I like that one is because it seems like it can be done relatively cheaply. It would connect 2 of the busiest airports in the country. It would connect 2 of the fastest growing metro areas in the country, and you could get it in before they outgrew the project and started causing problems like we ran into here. Just because of that, when I really dove into it and looked into that, I was like, this is a great idea. And another thing about that project for me is every time the conversation comes up nationally, we look to California high-speed rail as an example of why not to do it. Mm-hmm. Because it's so expensive. If we look at the upgrades on the NEC, we're talking about $110 billion. Those are all going to get funded, but still it's a lot of money. And so when people look at the subject, they start thinking, well, this is really expensive. It's too expensive for us to do. And one reason I think that's the mindset is because we're building it in expensive places, and we're not building it in inexpensive places when we could. And so I think if Atlanta to Charlotte were built, and it were built fairly cheaply, and it were pretty successful because it certainly is set up to be successful, then that could be a good example for the rest of the country to do it in various places where it might make sense.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm recalling back to your video on that subject. If I recall, wasn't the official alignment a really bad one, like down a highway and then a blip over to Greenville and then down a highway again?
The preferred alignment is almost all greenfield, but then it does have this very weird kind of jog to hook up with Greenville, Spartanburg. I always mix up the Berg and the Ville.
Oh, in Pennsylvania, we have a Pittsburgh Townville, a Pottsburg Townville, a Harrisburg Townville, a Mifflinburg Townville,
and a Lewisburg Townville, at least.
Navigating is hard out there. But if I recall, you came up with a much better alignment that I think it was at least the same, if not lower cost, and the same, if not faster.
Oh, the one that I liked, I got some flack for that. Skipped Greenville, Spartanburg, and I went south through Columbia and Augusta.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I did that is because the freeways are pretty uniquely
straight
positioned. Yeah, to support that. That's, one of the premises of the channel was just to kind of look, because it's people throw out ideas, but then they're not really looked at in any depth. And so, one of the ideas thrown out was, well, why don't we just run high-speed rail on the freeways? Well, no one really looked at whether or not
the
that
hub
makes
lane
sense.
isn't getting much use anyway.
Yeah, no one really looked
It's a really high occupancy vehicle.
Right. No one really looked at whether or not that made any sense. They just looked at the freeway that they're on and said, hey, why not put a train here? And in my experience so far is you have a broad spectrum of suitability. There are some freeways that it's really not a good idea. They're really not all that fast at all. And then there are some that are, much better. That particular setup down to Columbia and Augusta, and then on I think it's I-20 into Atlanta, super fast. Probably the best example in the country, at least that I've seen so far. So I think that's why that worked out. I think if I remember correctly, that would be a little bit more expensive. It wouldn't be really a whole lot faster between Atlanta and Charlotte because it had farther to go. But just in terms of average speed, it would be quite a bit faster. And that was the one I liked, so I'm definitely not voting against that one. And another thing I get in the comments a lot of the time is, no, it shouldn't be this way, it should be this way instead. And my view is, really, you should have both. Maybe not high-speed rail on both, but maybe you can have a 186 mile per hour or a 200 mile per hour system on one, and then like 125 mile per hour or 110 mile per hour commuter rail on the other for a more thorough system.
Express service and then local transfers.
Yeah, just better overall service. Like a lot of the time when you're looking at how to get between two areas, I don't think it has to be an either or. I think you can have both, and I think you can do both well. This is kind of another premise of the channel, is just looking at value.
Minutes saved per $100 million, I think is your metric. I've used that with respect to several people now, because I love your metric. Yeah. It makes so much sense.
I don't think it's the best, because it doesn't really consider throughput, but yeah, it's one way to look at it.
Perhaps person minutes saved per $100 million. Take the cost per minute faster and multiply by a function proportional to the population over distance squared decay ratio to estimate trips generated based on city population and distance from it, as well as perhaps multiplied by an anticipated number of trains per hour to estimate the fraction of those trips the HSR line would be capable of carrying. Actually, this last consideration might help quickly discern the value of triple or single tracking in relationship to its cost. Stu, I'm giving this to you as a challenge. You have a new Stuculus function to derive.
Yeah, so on the subject, so this is something that always was of quite a bit of interest to me. So there's this thing in model railroading called proto-freelancing. So it's either you model a prototype, you scratch build buildings, go out and measure them yourself and make perfect replicas of what actually was, track by track, street by street, building by building. That's more for the rivet counter crowd. Then you have the freelancers who are on another side. It's like, oh, I like this train. It's pretty. I'll run it, even if it makes no sense at all. It's in a place out of geography and time. It's just your own little playground. What's a very large contingent of the hobby now, over the past 20 to 40 years, is proto-freelancing, where you make something that's hypothetical, but not like crayon on a map, where you go and you look into the history. It's like, oh, this division was purchased by that railroad. What if it was purchased by that railroad instead? And then how would it work through the years? Or maybe there was never a railroad in this valley, but if there was, and because I want one to, where would it go? Which towns would it stop at? And that is, at least as far as I'm concerned, almost exactly what you're doing. Sure. Because whenever I describe your channel to other people, I say that you design HSR, again, similarly, not just crayoning on a map, but ooh, Charlotte to Atlanta in a perfectly straight line. You put a lot of effort into high quality corridors with very long curves and low grades, and it's just really impressive to me how, I guess, you've basically been able to backdoor an education in civil engineering. You're really good at coming up with these routes that are just so plausible. Why haven't we already built them yet?
Right. That was kind of incremental. I took a very fast and loose approach early on, and as I went, deficiencies became pretty clear, and I really strove to improve what I was doing just to keep from embarrassing myself. Once someone knowledgeable caught on to what I was doing.
You are too modest.
I do it in such a way that is, like you said, it's semi-plausible, but it is not super technical. I look at it as stuff that you cover in derivative calculus.
This is quite the simile you're setting up. I wonder where you go with it.
Yeah, so, you have derivatives in calculus, and then you have, I'm probably going to say the name wrong, Riemann sums, which is if you kind of break down a curve into steps, you get an approximation of the curve. And so that's my approach, is to approximate the curve. So rather than doing it the technical way, I take an approximation which is much faster and allows me to look at a map and translate that into a route in a few days instead of a few weeks or a few months.
Oh, is that the whiteboard that you have? It's your criteria for evaluating cost?
Yeah, that's the cost. So I have a spreadsheet that I plug everything into, and basically the technical part of that is I will draw the route out on Google Maps, and specifically Google Maps because it has distance hashing.
Oh.
So I can see the conditions of every mile on a route that I map out. And that's how I translate it on the cost. For the route itself, this is fairly rough, but it kind of evens out over distance. Like you said, I've kind of backdoored engineering, so I know more or less how it's supposed to work, but I've really never delved into the math.
You've reinvented engineering from first principles.
So you have this concept of, I'm familiar with geometry and higher math, so I kind of get it, but I've never really taken the time to figure out how it works computationally. You have this concept of chords on an arc to figure out exactly what speed you can go through a certain curve. That's pretty heavy duty as far as figuring goes. And so a much easier way to approximate it is to take a radius within that arc and say, okay, that's pretty close. And that gives you a pretty good idea of how fast you could go through that curve, even though you're not getting a precise idea. And so that's
basically like a speed chart. Like if you have a 2 mile radius, it's X many miles per hour. If it's a 3 mile radius, it's Y many, and so on.
Yeah. And then kind of the same way with acceleration, it's more stair step than figuring out the actual curve. One example where I kind of upped my game was the first few videos. I didn't really pay any attention to elevation. Don't tell anyone. And then someone let me know about Google Earth Pro and how you can draw a line out on Google Earth Pro and see the elevation profile along that line, right? And so obviously that's quite revealing, and you see all the places where you're going to run into either a hill or a mountain or a ravine, where you need to use a viaduct, where you need a tunnel, where you can manage earthworks within reason. And that was kind of where the routes really started to refine, when I started taking that into consideration along with generally accepted profiling for high-speed rail routes.
Was that around the time of your Pennsylvania high-speed rail video?
It was after that.
Oh, because that's actually how I discovered you. Like, how many years ago is that? 2.5 at this point? But yeah, no, I really liked your creative idea of following the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Although I was curious about the steep ascents up the mountain slopes there.
Yeah. So what I did on that one was I plotted points and got elevations, and then I went from the topo. Like a topo map to see what the differences were. So that was kind of a progression from real early on. I wasn't paying attention to elevation at all. Then I was like, okay, shoot, I better...
Z-axis? What's that? This is just a flat map to me.
Like, okay, that's a good point that, this route following the electrical in upstate New York runs into a mountain right here. And so you might actually have a tunnel there. Right, that's a good point. So I should probably start paying attention to elevation. So I started doing that with topographical maps, but then Google Earth Pro ended up being much, much more accurate and useful in that regard. So Pennsylvania was topographical, probably a little bit more difficult than I presented.
I completely agree, Stu. A much more realistic routing is via Downtown State College, Pennsylvania, through the Utilities Tunnel under Calder Way. I'm presently desperately trying to get the borough to future-proof to be forward-compatible with a subterranean high-speed rail alignment.
But that's okay. There are approximations. Really the point of anything I do on that channel is conversational. Right? It's just to get people thinking and talking about the subject and seeing if it makes sense to them, and maybe where they lived it would be like a good idea and how you might do it. That's the basic idea of the channel. So it doesn't
to get
have
like to 90% design.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be super precise. It just has to get you thinking about what that might be like for you where you live.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that we need more people like you doing that in the world, because HSR is hard enough as it is, and it's nice to have just fun inspiration brought into it. It's just nice for HSR to be fun again, because so much of it is just the dry sadness of winnowing budgets. No, it's like we're finally going to get California high-speed rail for my grandchildren's grandchildren, and at the cost of a small subcontinent's GDP.
Right. Yeah, well, it's even more depressing when you're a Californian.
I was a Californian. My parents voted on that bond measure. They're still waiting for it. Yeah. So then I guess maybe final question. Okay. Given that you basically already do this digitally, would you ever consider building a model railroad? And if so, would it ever have any high-speed rail in it?
I thought the short answer is yes. I thought about this reading through your questions and very much consider what I do to be the same thing. It's just not in a physical space.
May I then recommend digital railroading, Mr. Stew? Perhaps Train Sim World, or Train Z Simulator, or Rolling Line, or Derailed Valley. On that note, have you ever considered going into game development? I mean, I love your videos and all, but what I personally want to do is to pilot an HSR train set between Fort Worth and Dallas, or Chicago and Detroit. Actually, joking aside, the Detroit HSR route was one of my absolute favorite videos of his, until only just recently eclipsed by this week's Lakeshore Limited high-speed rail video. Both have such cinematic renderings, and the Detroit video's HSR trains weaving over top an NS Dearborn Yard literally sent shivers down my spine. Both are also linked in the show notes.
And my playground is the entire planet. So
California doesn't have basements that big?
Anyone listening can envy that space because it's not fitting in your garage.
Oh, goodness.
I used to be, and still am, into Christmas villages.
I'm laughing here not to make fun of Stu's interests, but because I used to model in ON30, the prime scale for Christmas Village layouts. I even once bought a few cheap Christmas Village coaches to use them for a side project where I made an all-dinky train, cutting each coach down to 3 windows long.
And anyone who's ever put together a Christmas Village has really, really wanted to have a train in it. And so I haven't had the opportunity to go full bore like I have a couple of years in the past. But if I ever get back into it to a level that I have been at, I think a train could definitely work its way into there. So,
Aw, damn, I wish you had told me before I sold off my own 30 stuff. I would have happily given you the dinky passenger coaches. Alternatively, I am 10,000% certain that your supporters, myself included, would go absolutely fucking apeshit for a Lucid Stew next-gen Acela Christmas HSR Village. Bachmann does, in fact, now make the train set, so just giving you the idea there.
Maybe not, I know a guy who has trains running through like his entire backyard. I used to know another guy who had his whole garage filled with the thing and had a control room and the whole shebang. I will never get to that level, but...
Well, 3 years ago, you never thought that you would have become a de facto
right,
civil engineer.
Exactly. You never say never,
All right, well, this has been an absolutely spectacular interview. Thank you so much. Oh, no, I do have one last question.
Okay.
Lucid Stew, where did that come from? And why not something like salient goulash or cogent porridge?
That's a lot less interesting than it might seem. When I was in my teens and 20s, I used to play thrash rhythm guitar. And like anyone who played guitar, dreamed of being a rock star. And Lucid Stew was one of the band names that me and a friend of mine came up with for the band, where we spent way more time coming up with band names than we did practicing. So it was inevitable that Lucid Stew would never become famous for thrash metal anyway.
Oh my goodness, that's fascinating. So, thank you very much, Lucid Stew. Where can people find your work?
You can find my work at youtube.com/Lucid Stew. It's all one word. Yeah, I'm mostly on YouTube. I'm on social media too, but you're more likely to run into me and get my attention on YouTube, so look that up. I also have a Printify poster store that you can visit. I've been selling posters just to try to wean myself off of waning YouTube ad revenue a little bit, and that's lucidstew.printify.com. So you can find me there as well.
All right. Thank you so much for this spectacular and fascinating interview.
Thank you. Thank you for the interview. It was fantastic.
You'll be happy to know that he and I talked for hours more into the evening, and have kept up a working relationship since, for which we have a few more tricks under our sleeves yet to come. Once again, thank you so much, Lucid Stew, for the interview, and the bottomlessly fascinating and effervescently congenial poise you brought with you. You're the first major YouTuber I've interviewed. I'm certain at least 12 to 13 orders of magnitude more subscribers than I have listeners. If I could say anything, it is that you are far too modest. You've bootstrapped an almost unmatched level of expertise in transit policy, civil engineering, politics, and straight-up gumshoes investigative reporting. It has been truly engrossing to follow your rise, see your developments, and watch your artistry flourish. I remember almost jumping out of my seat when I watched your Cascadia HSR video and noticed you animated the streetcar crossing the Tillicum Bridge. You bring a level of diligence to your work almost unparalleled in the urbanism space, and yet manage to preserve a subtle touch of delightful whimsy in whatever you do. I look forward to your videos every single week, and I cannot recommend them enough. This has been episode 16 of the Proto-Future podcast, Interview with Lucid Stew. The theme music is Spark of Life by Benjamin Lazarus through Tribe of Noise. I would like to thank my extremely generous and patient patrons, Pedro Reyes, Ron Kleiss, Bill Ford, Linda Eskin, Roger Coleman, and Bill Brown of the Rail Brothers. If you would like to know more, you can visit the website at www.bgtmrring.org. That's Bravo Golf Tango, Michael Romeo Romeo, Indigo November Golf, Oscar Romeo Golf, to listen to the Manifesto and Prologue series, watch the Modern Modeling Clinic anthology, or read the free-to-access Patreon production blog, and please consider donating as little as $1 an episode to help for hosting and equipment costs and support what I do. This content is CAN credentialed. You can report instances of harassment, abuse, or other harm to their hotline at 617-249-4255 or on their website at creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org. To the best of my knowledge, this podcast is entirely free of content generated, edited, produced, or modified in any way by AI. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced on the ancestral lands of the Chiricahua Apache, Pescardo, Oodham Hewitt, Hohokam, Sobaipuri, Tohono Oodham, Kokopah, Haised Oodham, Maricopa, Upper Pima, Yavapai Apache, Huatsayan, Nawuvi, Cahuilia, Luisenyo, Serrano, Tongva, Fernandenyo Tataviam, Chumash, Wyatt, Southern Pomo, Gritan Rancheria, Mewuk, Miwok, Muekma, Olone, Rametush, Owaswas, Amamutsan, Rumson, Esalen, Selinian, Obispenyo, Ventureño Chumash, Barbareño Chumash, and Amalu tribes. I would like to thank them for their historical stewardship of Arizona and California. Thank you very much for listening. Keep riding trains, keep punching Nazis, and keep building a better future.
That's an interesting perspective.